Well, a big hello to everyone who's logged in this morning, afternoon, or evening from wherever in the world you've logged in, whether you've come in through Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn to join into this Resilient Lincolnshire series. It's our pleasure and honor at the Lincoln International Business School, the University of Lincoln, to welcome you to this Resilient Lincolnshire series this morning. I'm Ruchi Agarwal. I'm the Director for Business Development at the Business School, and I extend a warm welcome to you. Now, when the business school found itself, in the situation that we all are in April this year, we looked for a platform to stay connected with our business audience and bring our academics, business audience, and students together to be discussing things which were prime importance to them. How do we continue business the way it was? How do we get business beyond the curve? And that's when we started this platform, this digital platform, Resilient Lincolnshire. I'm really pleased that since April 2020, right up till now, and we're sitting in November now, we have conducted a number of discussions across the spectrum of business leaders, mostly in Lincolnshire so far, with our students, with our researchers, with our academics. And we listened to what was keeping them awake. We listened to what their hopes and aspirations were. And through that series, we came across some themes that were emerging very clearly for all of us to listen into. We chose to call them leadership lenses. So as a business school, as the Lincoln International Business School, we decided to pick out those themes and those lenses and put it out to the global environment to be able to see, get perspectives, and test them against the issues that the global leadership might be facing as well. So we picked 4 themes out of the discussions that we had. And those themes were resilient leadership, emotional leadership, responsible leadership, and technological leadership. A lot of these you will recognize yourselves as well, in your part of the world. So we decided to put up a version called Resilient Lincolnshire Global, which is what you're logged into today, to get together a global panel that's going to deliberate on the relevance of that particular lens for their part of the world, and of course globally, because everyone has a global mindset today, or necessarily needs to have a global mindset. So we ran our first lens last week, which was on the resilient theme. And in case you missed it, you can watch it on our YouTube channel at Lincoln International Business School. And today we are deeply honored to have a wonderful global panel, which is going to discuss the second leadership lens in our series out of the 4, which is the emotional lens of leadership. And I'm really, really pleased that I have with me the director of the Lincoln International Business School and Pro-Vice Chancellor, Dr. Craig Marsh, to host this today. Morning, Craig.
Good morning, Ruchi. Great to be here.
Thank you. Thanks for coming through. And, as always, what a wonderful panel we have today. And, given the permeable nature of education and learning that the university believes in, this seems to be a wonderful panel together for you today.
Yeah, very much so. And we have experts from right around the world, actually, on the subject. And it's going to be so interesting to see what those global themes are, what consistent themes we have under the subject of the emotional lens of leadership.
Excellent, Craig. So with that, I think I'll hand over to you to introduce your panel, and we really look forward to a wonderful discussion this morning.
Yes, thank you so much, Ruchi. So in 1995, Daniel Goleman published his seminal work, Emotional Intelligence. And while the term emotional intelligence wasn't a new term, I think the book brought the concept to a global audience at that point, and certainly made the author's fortune, that's for sure. So, and I think his core idea is that there's a correlation or a connection between strong performing leaders and emotional intelligence. And I think emotional intelligence is popularly described as the ability to monitor one's own and other people's emotions, and to use understanding of different emotions to guide one's thinking and behavior. So I think it's probably really difficult to overestimate the impact that the idea of emotional intelligence has had since then, over the last 25 years on management thinking. His work has generated an entire new way of thinking about how to measure, develop, and identify emotional intelligence as a really essential part of individual progression in both children, actually, and indeed adults. And claims to its benefits include being perceived more positively by others, better social relations inside and outside work, better psychological well-being, and of course, more effective leadership styles, particularly actually those related to transformational leadership styles. So these days it's really quite difficult to avoid the term, particularly if you're looking at, for example, job adverts in relation especially to senior leadership or management roles. But of course, the idea of emotional intelligence raises many interesting questions for current and aspiring leaders, and for those who are actually working in the field of leadership, like myself and many of my colleagues on the panel today. And actually, what's interesting, there's surprisingly little academic evidence to show that high levels of emotional intelligence predict leadership effectiveness, which is really odd, just given how popular the subject. So there's something quite interesting going on in there. So it raises questions such as, what role does emotion play in effective leadership? It's a core question. Is it open to everybody to master emotional intelligence, or only a select few? Does gender play a role in emotional intelligence? How can the emotional side of leadership be mentored and developed? If authentic leadership is something to be striven for, how does mastering our emotional responses allow us to be authentic? Are there particular emotions that are more or less important in developing and performing leadership? And of course, are these questions relevant in different global contexts? So to help us explore these questions and others related to this topic, and any that our audience may, of course, also have, and I'd really encourage people to contribute their own questions on this subject. I'm joined today, as Rishi said, by a fantastic global panel of experts who actually combine both practitioner and academic experience on the subject. So I'm really delighted to introduce today. We have Simone Bao from the Bahamas, who describes herself as a limitless life coach, a certified speaker. She's written on the subject, a corporate trainer, personal development coach, HR strategist consultant. So welcome, Simone.
Thank you.
We have Dr. Silvio De Bono, who's from Malta, and he's in charge of the IDEO Educational Group. He has his DBA in this area, specializes in consultancy and change management, communication, business process re-engineering, company restructuring, and a particular specialism in the area of developing leaders. So welcome, Silvio.
Hello, Greg.
Good to see you.
Good to see you too.
We have, thanks, Silvio. We have Professor Abigail Powell. Abby is Professor of Sociology and Social Policy here at the University of Lincoln. And she's an expert in the gender division and labour in the home and workplace, and has a particular passion for ideas of equality. Welcome, Abby.
Hi, nice to be here.
Great to see you. Very delighted to be joined by a good friend, Dr. Uday Salunke from India, from Mumbai in India. And amongst many experiences and expertises, Uday is the head of the Lincolnshire Institute of Management and Development, known as the WE School in Mumbai, group director. And he has a particular passion for leadership, design thinking in its relation to leadership, innovation, and of course, entrepreneurial leadership. Uday, it's great to see you.
Thank you. Thanks, Greg.
And we also have with us Dr. Kalyani Alunke, also from India, from Delhi. And Kalyani is Associate Professor and Head of Alumni Relations at OP Jindal Global University just outside Delhi. I was fortunate to visit there this time last year. And is also a visiting professor at the ISDE Law and Business School in Spain, Stockholm. And so she has a background in this area, in internationalization, and is now looking after alumni relations. And Kalyani, it's great to see you. Welcome. So there's our panel introduced. So without further ado, let's dive into the discussion. And I think what I'd like to perhaps explore first. I mean, Abby, you are one of our academic experts in this particular area, Abby, and I'd be very interested just to start to think through about some of those questions about, what role does emotion play in leadership fundamentally, and is it something that's open to all of us? Are there gendered aspects to emotion? And what advice do we have to people, if you like, who are thinking, well, is this something that I can learn from, or perhaps you take us on from there, Abby?
Yeah, lots to think about there. Thank you, Craig. I guess to kick off, I think you reflected in your introduction that there were there's a whole range of emotions that we all experience and feel, and some of them are positive and negative. And I think in terms of gender, emotion is actually a gendered concept, and that's something that's worth thinking about in the background of this. So often men are described stereotypically as we think of men as the rational leader, whereas women are sometimes described as being emotional, and that has quite, when someone's described as emotional, it often has quite negative connotations as well. So I think that's just something worth holding in the background when we think about this. But I think for me, that's where the concept of emotional intelligence is really quite useful, because it goes beyond just thinking about the emotions that we might experience and feel, but thinking about how we manage, use those, deal with those, both in ourselves as leaders, but also the people that we're leading as well. More broadly, in terms of the gender aspect, I think that, again, if we think about stereotypes, women are probably socialized more in terms of dealing with emotions, and in that sense, women may feel more comfortable in terms of emotion. When we think about what emotional leadership means, women might have, because of that socialization and how we're taught to behave as women might feel more comfortable than men within that. But as I said, I think we need to be careful there in terms of not being too essentialist, because I think that is about socialization. I'm definitely not a believer that women naturally lead in one way and men naturally lead in another way.
So Abby, just on that particular point, because this is an area that is so interesting to explore. As you mentioned at the start, it's often that being emotional, it often does have those negative connotations,
yeah.
and it's often, indeed, it's because of socialization reasons you mentioned, is often associated with women rather than men. And is that something that, are we starting to move away from those ideas now? Do you think that's still very much with us, or is that speak perhaps the women panel members can contribute to this? Is it still a burden for us in society to have emotion characterized in that kind of way?
Yeah, I think at least on paper and theoretically we are starting to move away from that. But for example, excuse me, in my own research, we've looked at gender in very male-dominated industries such as the construction industry, and I think that kind of C-suite of leadership do have a real understanding of this and the importance of emotional leadership. But the leaders on the ground, if you like, that's not necessarily what we have seen there. So the people that are actually managing a construction site on the ground, for example, there was still very much narratives around heroic leadership and that kind of autocratic model of leadership that we see there, and that can be quite challenging for both men and for women. And I think that's not to say that emotions aren't used by those leaders, and I think they're used in very particular ways. For example, and it speaks a lot to what the workplace culture is, I think, and what you see in terms of what kind of behaviours are rewarded. But definitely on the construction site, the emotion of shame, for example, is used quite a lot. So there's very much a tradition of long working hours and presenteeism, and if you don't live up to those ideals, leaders can shame workers into behaving in a certain way because of that. So it's really interesting how emotions can actually be used in positive and negative ways. And
negative ways, almost as a weapon in that case, in the sense.
Absolutely, yeah.
As a weapon of leadership. So I think it's really interesting for you to identify a couple of things actually there. One is one of the questions that emerges is, is emotional intelligence just to do with and the benefit of senior leadership, or and are we seeing less of that at junior levels? Or there was a particular context that you were talking about, Adam, which was kind of construction site, still very heavily male dominated. And is there a gap emerging between junior levels and senior levels in terms of that, or is it to do with the male dominated part of it?
I think there's probably an element of both, and I think, as I said, I think elements of emotional leadership, authentic leadership, notions of shared leadership and systems leadership, they're coming through in leadership training, and I think that's probably taking a while to kind of filter down, if you like, through the ranks. And I think I'm very much a firm believer that everybody, regardless of that positional authority, has the opportunity to display leadership. But I think the workplace culture can set norms, as I said, around what's expected and rewarded, that can sometimes challenge or make it difficult to display that emotional leadership as well.
That's so interesting. So I think, Abby, you've already touched on several really interesting things there, and And Kalyani, I know you have a particular perspective on this one from your background and experience and expertise. Would you like to come in there and give us your insights on it?
Yeah, thanks, Greg. So I would actually draw a distinction between emotional intelligence and emotional labor. There's a certain amount of emotional labor that goes into running any institution, in building any organization. Things like creating a welcoming work environment, right? Making sure everyone feels accepted or feels supported. Or even simple things like, emptying the dredges that collect at the bottom of the coffee machine in the bin, right? I mean, in my experience, my observation is that women disproportionately perform this labor in many organizations and institutions, and especially in universities, right? A lot of the leadership roles which involve pastoral care, you will see probably more women in those roles. Now, what happens is because that kind of emotional labor is not factored into the formal evaluation procedures that we conduct, we find that no one receives any additional credit for, not that people are doing it for credit, but no one receives that additional appreciation or credit for doing that work. And so what happens is that people who are investing more energy doing these things, their climb to the top is slower, somehow is slowed down, because a lot of what they're investing their energy in doesn't count or doesn't show up in the official evaluations that we do. And maybe this, in the end, this all aggregates and explains why we have a lack of emotional empathy in many organizational structures at the very top.
Kalyani, thank you. And you've introduced the idea of emotional labor. I think Abby also referred to that concept in the past. And emotional labor actually having some negative connotations, the sort of work that you do in organizations, which is hard work. It's not something that you would necessarily say has a positive benefit, but in your perspective actually falls unequally on women for historical and socialization reasons. And therefore that then has detrimental effects on the views at senior levels in the organization. I mean, I think I've broadly characterized how that may work there. So thank you, Kalyani. So I think one of the things that we've now identified is that there are some, Abby, thank you so much for the comment. I know you have much more to say on that. And I think we've identified that there is not, that emotion and leadership aren't necessarily entirely positive things, that there are some elements of emotion, both for historical and traditional reasons, but also because of the way our organizations still function, which I think we need to pay attention to and be aware of. And I think we're also starting to think a little bit about how emotions work at different levels in the organization, and perhaps a lack of perception sometimes at the top of the emotional demands on working perhaps at different levels of that organization. So those are some quite interesting areas that I think we've got into. And I'm really pleased that we're looking at not just the positive aspect of emotional intelligence, we will come on to. And Simone, if I may bring you in at this point, Simone, because I know that a lot of your work is on the development and the mentoring of young leaders, and I know this is one of the areas that you're particularly expertise in. So perhaps we can come on and think through a little bit on if you like, in terms of the positive development of emotional intelligence in leaders. How do you do that? Is it possible to develop emotional intelligence in young people and in the more junior leaders? And how do you go about that? Simone, could you lead us off on that one? I think you might have some slides to share with us as well.
Yes, thank you so much. And I do believe that it can be developed. I think like any skill, we can learn it. We can understand what it is, and we can really perfect the concept of using emotions in a positive way. And I think what Abby raised as far as emotions being regulated to a gender is a false idea, because we are human. And so as human beings, we all have emotions, and it's okay to express them. You know, we've been socialized that men should not, and women, it's okay. And for some women, it's not okay, depending on where you are. And so I think that developing that concept is very important in our young leaders. And so I'm going to make this attempt now to share just a few things that on the concept. Okay, there we go. So I want to focus on how emotional intelligence and mentoring can make a difference in leadership. And so if we move to the next slide here, first of all, we know that mentoring actually does work, right? The statistics out there prove in all of these areas and more that people, it's said that 97% of professionals that have a mentor say that it's a valuable experience for them. So mentoring creates retention. There are a large number of millennials, particularly, who will say, in the next 2 years, I'm going to leave my organization if I am not developed. It adds to productivity. People work better. It lends to advancement in the organization, to profitability, and also to diversity. So the statistics show that, in particular, advancing women and minorities through mentorship actually works. Senior leadership, CEOs, also mentioned the value of mentorship. And so we know that it works. So how do we combine it with emotional intelligence? So when we look at the next slide, and we look just at the model of Goleman that you mentioned, Craig, and the 4 quadrants: self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, and relationship management, and how we can actually use this in learning and development and mentorship. So I want to focus on, first of all, those 2 words on either side of the grid, the who and the do, because I found lately that it's very important to separate those 2 for the sake of understanding. I think when we are growing up, we're always asked this question: what do you want to be when you grow up? And lately I found a little challenge with the phrasing of that question, because a what doesn't imply a who, which be, or state of being, implies. What focuses on your do, and your who focuses on your identity. And so when we look at emotional intelligence, on the left side focuses on who you are and how you show up in the world, your understanding of yourself and your ability to understand other people. And then when you focus on your do, your actions, this focuses now on how you manage yourself in your emotional state. And then how do you cultivate and nurture relationships? And so I find that these areas are particularly important in our workplace cultures, because oftentimes we see the toxic side of it. We see people who may not have a very good understanding of who they are and why they act the way they do. And so certain things would trigger off certain behaviors, and people are left wondering, well, what just happened here? Why did we get this response? Why did we get this huge reaction? Why does this person treat me in this way or not interact with me at all? And so I think emotional intelligence can really help young leaders coming up to understand, how am I supposed to show up in my work environment? What is my leadership brand? And so through mentoring, we can see modeling of these behaviors through our senior leaders. And then we can get feedback, which is so important. So I may not be as self-aware. I may not know how I show up. I may not know how I shut down. And so when I have a trusted relationship with someone that I admire and respect, and they can share with me, this is what you're doing, this is what you're not doing, this is what I would recommend that you do when you get in a situation like this. why not try this strategy? And so it will help our young leaders to learn how to navigate the workplace culture. And so I think that this is critical as a skill. And this is something that I've observed as well, for younger leaders to understand how to navigate relationships and how to navigate office politics, so to speak, and the varying dynamics that we find in our workplaces. And so I just want to close really on my prepared remarks on this next point, that we will see the leadership difference when we are intentional about growing these behaviors that emotional intelligence can provide for us. So when organizations develop leaders who know who they are, who are self-aware, who can identify what they're feeling and when, and can positively express that, when they can regulate their actions, when they can inspire other people, when they can show empathy and cultivate positive relationships, then I believe we will experience transformed organizational cultures where people aren't, the statistics will go down that say people are leaving people. People are leaving their managers when they leave a job.
Simone, thank you so much for sharing those insights on the core of emotional intelligence and the application, particularly to the development of mentoring of young leaders. And I think everyone would agree, actually, me included, that almost regardless of your position, having a mentor of some form really does allow you to reflect and balance and to think through some of those dimensions that you've just been describing to us, doesn't it? And you're talking particularly about young leaders, Simone. I mean, I think we have on the panel actually several not quite so young leaders, but certainly senior ones. And I'm wondering what your perspective is on senior leadership in the relationship with emotional intelligence. Is it something that's still relevant to senior leaders? Are you seeing more or less emotional intelligence? I'm just interested in your
Yeah, definitely. I think senior leadership needs it, and in my experience, it seems to be a deficiency, unfortunately, from what I have seen. And it's, again, the feedback that I would get from persons who are interacting with them. And I think in large parts, it is empathy, where people can really feel that senior leaders care. There's a feeling that senior leaders are detached and disconnected from their organizations. And that comes through in their decision-making and in their communication or lack thereof. And so oftentimes it is the human resources professional that tries to stand in the gap there and sometimes gets squashed.
There's a mess. I wonder if that's something to do with power and the position. And I know my colleagues, I'm sure, have a perspective on this. And Silvio, I wonder if this is something you do have a particular perspective on. I know both Silvio and Uday, I'm sure, have a thought on it. Silvio, what's your perspective?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Craig.
Silvio?
Yes, I thank you very much. I completely agree with what Simone has just said, with one exception though. I still think that leaders are, even if they're at the very top, they're very emotional. They think about themselves, they think about their family, they think about the well-being, and they think about the future. They think about the organization as a whole. Sometimes we tend to, in my opinion, make a fundamental mistake when we try to understand leadership. And this goes back, when we try to understand leadership by putting it in boxes. And what I have been trying to do over the last 2 decades of my academic life and my business life, because they were simultaneously, brought together, is basically trying to unfold these parameters and open it for discussion. Because I do not believe that we can understand leadership, particularly when we're looking into emotional leadership on its own, without looking, for example, what type of organization structure the leader is working in, the variances that vary from a completely mechanistic structure to an organic one. And, we all know that it doesn't agree completely mechanistic or organic. The level of the organization, the internal culture within the organization, the external culture within the organization. Leaders at the top are very emotional. And I'm probably making a judgment here, but it's a positive judgment. One thing which I've learned, even when I've chaired very big institutions, is how lonely it can become. And when you're extremely lonely in making your own decisions, you feel that you are emotionally detached, not because you don't have emotions, but you feel because others are not emotional towards you. Everybody would come and say, very good job, boss, well done, when it's good for them. But everybody would look at you in a completely different way when the decision you take or you make, because you are a leader and someone has to make it, not necessarily a popular leader, because if we want to be popular, we just all decide to go and sell ice creams. No, that would make it a very popular leader. But when you have to make decisions, which are very often contrary to this decision.
Oh, I think we may have lost Silvio in mid comment, mid insight there. But and so I'm sure Silvio will come back and join us in a second. But I think we got the gist of Silvio's insight there, actually, which is more about I think just a couple of really interesting points. So we've heard that senior leaders are not unemotional, and I think that's really interesting. Sorry, Silvia, I think we just cut off there. I'm just summarising your points there, if I may. So senior leaders are not unemotional, but often the context of their role can perhaps affect the way that they're perceived by others, particularly the loneliness of leadership, the sorts of decisions they have to make. Perhaps in some ways the sheer difficulty and the stress of being in that kind of position can perhaps have them interpreted to a point that Simone made earlier of being a little cold and perhaps unempathetic. And I know Kalyani was also referring to this idea a little earlier on. And I wonder if at that point I may perhaps just bring Uday, you and Professor Solanke. Uday, you have thought deeply about these things, and you yourself, of course, are in a very senior position. So perhaps, Uday, your personal reflection on some of these questions about senior leadership and emotional intelligence, and also I know that you think a lot about the development of young leaders, particularly in terms of transformational leadership. So I'd be very interested in your perspective on this question, Uday.
Thanks, Craig. In fact, we already learned so much as a resilience, adaptability, embracing management during COVID. But Lincolnshire has given us one more platform about resilient leadership. And I must compliment you and your team. The last weeks I watched that video. It was fabulous. It was really nice. But I feel resilience or resilient leadership is a crux core of almost any kind of leadership, and has to be. And when we're going through such kind of VUCA world. But as you were just mentioning, certainly I at least feel that EQ part, emotional quotient part, or EI part, is almost 80 to 85% of senior leadership, definitely, there's no question. 10 to 15% is IQ. And if I really look at Indian scenario, and typically in education as well, most of the very talented guys, they get into some of the best business school, best engineering colleges and everywhere. So everybody is almost at the same platform. But who moves forward to that top position? Really, who exhibits that kind of EI side of their own personality, or who nurtures, as Simone very rightly mentioned, that it kind of get nurtured over a period of time. So that's the way at least I feel this non-negotiable component, non-negotiable part for absolutely senior leadership. But I also feel that need to be nurtured from a very young, talented youngsters, young minds. When we get into the business school's point of view itself, and maybe if you allow me to cite one or two examples, which we actually did, is somewhere, see, country like India is, I'm sure Kalyani would concur with me, and you also, both of you, you and Rich, are also familiar, and your colleagues, so much about India, that there is so much of disparity in our society in terms of haves and have-nots. There's so much of divide of different kinds always. And one of the experiment when we thought of, wherein we felt that normally MBA kind of education is very much meant for very elite or privileged class, because who's eligible for MBA in the country? Only 6% of the kind of population which is educated, with 88% don't even reach to your graduation. So does that mean that 6% is supposed to be only leaders for the future and 88% not? So from that angle, when we really look forward to, and when we experimented, we picked up actually very young boys who are not qualified as per our regulators for the MBA. But we did kind of work with Mahindra and Mahindra. I'm sure this company may be familiar to many of you. And we picked up 2 boys out of kind of, hundreds of students. And they were not literate. They were just about junior college dropped out, but working the company. But only we checked on certain competencies, that do they have that tenacity to pursue? Do they have that fire in the belly? Do they wish to really go up in terms of learning point of view? And in that, when we picked up and we put them along with who's who, maybe we select about few hundred students from 15,000-20,000 selects in the country. And those already got through their kind of scores, like CAT scores and different multiple scores, like GMAT kind of scores. And they were kind of mentors, and these 2 guys were mentee. And what we realized, these 2 boys were coming from the very low end or low strata, economically low strata or underprivileged, who were drawing maybe about $50 kind of salary per month, and probably how they will cope up with. But believe me, the way in which when we looked at it, and we looked at actually the aspects from the emotional EI point of view, and our purpose was including the excluded kind of thought process, and can these 2 boys will learn the basic fundamental of when we talk about the visionary leadership is one of the aspect of transformational leadership. Then can they really do it? Can they probably get into the shoes of the other mentors? And to our surprise, not only they did just kind of passing, but they did fabulously well. And in this, what we could identify, the way they could get developed, but developing others. Because of these 2 boys, the 6+6 mentors which we give it to these 2 boys, they learn and they express their, in fact, kind of comments or thoughts that we learned so much from these 2 mentees than probably what we could really teach them. The values in the life, we could learn from them. And likewise, because they could see what is there in Indian society at that level. Otherwise, they were never valuing the people at that grassroots level. And likewise, I could really see very closely these 2 boys that in terms of influence point of view, when we talk about community leadership, when we talk about grassroots level leadership, can these elite boys go to the grassroots level and really do that kind of work, which is very unlikely. But we need to really nurture that community leadership from there only. And that we could really get a sense. And that empathy is there deep down in them. It's not really need not to be injected, need not to be taught, and need not to be nurtured. And likewise, what Simone also shown about 4 quadrants in terms of self-awareness, social and management, and even relationship management, all those aspects, probably we could see really, because these 2 boys coming from that grassroots level, understand teamwork, understand collaboration, because they survive on that at that level, because they face so much of adversities time and again. And service orientation is in their blood. Otherwise, we have to induct that kind of thought process. Adaptability, any kind of situation they go through it, because they face day in and day challenges for bread and butter as well. And in this overall thought process, they really learn, or probably these 2 boys could give back to the society. In fact, out of these 2 boys, this was a story in 0507, which we experimented later on as well. Today, this young gentleman, Prathamesh, out of 2 boys, one unfortunately passed away because of cancer. But the other gentleman today is heading one of the leading bank in the country. And today, even he gives back to the institution, which is not been taught. Otherwise, we have to teach people, maybe CEOs and MDs of the company, do you give back to the kind of society? And otherwise, government imposes 2% CSR kind of terms and those kind of conditions. But this comes very naturally. So somewhere deep down, I feel the way in which we experimented and we could learn, our students could learn, is only on the fabric of that emotional intelligence point of view. Maybe one more example I'll cite. I think Silvio is back. So because I just took his slot in the meantime, maybe later on, if I'll talk about the GCL, Global Citizen Leader, which we experimented, which is a fabulous again experiment. But please, great.
That would be great to come back and talk a little bit about that global aspect of leadership, which I know you're so passionate about yourself. But perhaps two really interesting insights from the example that you gave us there. And the first is the idea of kind of our traditional concepts of what makes a good leader, and particularly in societies that we've experienced, I think, in Europe, and certainly you alluded to in India. That says actually it's a very individualistic thing, it's quite competitive. You are a member of a certain group or elite, and you have to show how good you are to get to the top of that elite and get to the top. I spent many years in France, and France still particularly suffers from that aspect. There's kind of this elitism. It's very individual. And I think, you know, Simone has taught us that actually emotional intelligence is about the other. It's about regard for the other. It's about empathy. And your example of two boys who came from a very different background that you nurtured and mentored had that empathy instinctively because of their background and their socialization, and that worked much better for them in those areas of emotional intelligence. I find that absolutely fascinating as a really stark contrast, and of course a great illustration today of the work that you're doing at the WE School as well, to develop inclusivity and to promote those from more disadvantaged backgrounds. It's such an important part of your work there, but I'd never thought of it in terms of, you know, their ability or this instinctive possession of those aspects of emotional intelligence. So it's a really interesting case you have there. So thank you so much for sharing that. And I think we'll just return to that. And I think, Silvio, your connection is regained. Is that right? And Silvio, you have also, I think, a particular perspective in terms of sort of the future orientation of leaders,
yes,
their ability to adapt to circumstances, of course, particularly relevant right now. So Silvia,
yes,
perhaps share a little bit about your insights
yes.
on that.
Basically, what I've been trying to work on over the last 5-10 years in particular is to understand not the past theories and the past experiences of leadership, but try to look into the future leadership. So I have coined this term, anticipatory leadership, and trying to identify how can today's leaders be tomorrow's. So what can leaders do today which emotionally can affect what's going to happen tomorrow? Because this is what leadership is all about. You know, we teach in class, we teach in our classes and at the place of work that if you're a good leader, they don't need you today because the systems and the processes and everything is in place. So a leader has a place for tomorrow rather than today. And what I've identified through my research is that there are three main pillars of what one can look into in order to develop this, what I'm coining as anticipatory leadership. The first one, which was mentioned just now, is the preparation, the academic, technical preparation. Because, I mean, most of our CEOs, managing directors, people at the top, they're very good emotional leaders, but they haven't got the technical preparation to anticipate, to guess rather than guess, but to learn in a learned way what the future is going to look like, both from a business term, both from an economics terms. For example, when this pandemic took place and started way back in April, I was interviewed in one of the local newspapers, and I said that this is the best time to invest, and I had a lot of people calling me crazy, because they thought that investment is.
Well, I think we may have lost Silvio again. He's obviously struggling a little bit with the connection. There are many advantages to living on Malta, but perhaps connectivity isn't one of them. so Silvio, we will come back to you again as you managed to reconnect. But again, I think we caught the gist of what Silvio was telling us there, which is a little bit about the role of emotion in developing leaders who can anticipate the future. And perhaps to all of my panelists, I think that it would be remiss of us not to perhaps ask a generic question to all of you, if I may, actually, which is the one that Uday alluded to a couple of minutes ago, that I think probably more so than ever in our current circumstances, we're reminded of the fact that we are one global community because we're faced with a crisis the like of which the world has never seen. And I'd be very interested in your perspective in the relationship of our subject of emotion and leadership, whether we are also seeing the potential for the development of perhaps a global leader, somebody who perhaps possesses these traits that we've been discussing. Is that a concept? Is that something that we think we can get behind, particularly for our future generations of leader? I mean, I'd be very interested enough, perhaps just get a couple of minutes perspective from each of you in that particular area of question, if I may. And I see Silvio has managed to rejoin us. So
I don't know what's happening. This is the first time that it's happening. Usually we have very good connection.
Silvio, we're all absolutely used to it, and thank you. We absolutely got the gist, and hopefully you just picked up my question there, which is about, are we seeing the development of global leadership in terms of this concept, who are emotionally resilient, if I may? Abby, I'll be just perhaps come back to you. I'd love to hear your perspective on that, actually, from the studies and the work that you're doing. Is that something that you're seeing develop? Is that something we can be positive about or not in your perspective?
Well, I think if we look at the global stage at the moment, we're seeing that happening in both directions, for positive and negative as well, aren't we? But yeah, I think so. I think going back to the gender issue, for example, there's been quite a lot of news coverage that suggests that the countries that are led by women have managed the COVID pandemic much better than those led by men. And I think what's interesting about that is that the analysis that I've seen is suggesting that's not necessarily that the countries that have managed that well are all led by women, but the countries that have managed it poorly are all led by men. So I think that's an interesting kind of thing to think about.
I don't think any men on the panel
I think also for me, I think another part of that for me is, and where having emotional intelligence is important, is around and thinking about the future, is that recognizing as a leader that you don't necessarily have all the answers, and we have to listen to other people who have expertise in different areas at different points in time. And again, I think there's been good and bad examples of that in the current crises as well.
Yes,
I think I'll just leave
that final
there
point is a really critical one, isn't it? Because so often we promote experts into being positions of leadership, and the two, of course, can entirely sit together well. But actually, promoting somebody who has a degree of expertise in an area may actually lead them to tend to dictate and to be autocratic, in particular in their area of expertise, rather than actually engage and listen. And that is clearly related to some of the discussion we've had on their emotional resilience, actually, because that emotional resilience gives them the confidence to be able to say, I don't know all of the answers. And that doesn't necessarily always become an expert, does it? Whether that's an academic, or whether that's a doctor, or whether that's an accountant, or whatever your profession. Would you tend to agree with that?
Yeah, I think the other component of that is that when we're faced with these kind of really huge, difficult decisions to make, that there's an element of being vulnerable in there as well, because we maybe have to take big risks that we might not in times where we're not facing crisis or major challenges. And in taking risks, there has to be, the reason I say that can put people in a vulnerable position is the more we take risks, the increased likelihood is that we might fail as well. So I think Brene Brown is a good author here. She's written a lot about being brave, and I think that's a really important.
Isn't it interesting, Abby? And the kind of perspective, it's almost like kind of the inverse of a traditional notion of bravery or courageous, that actually bravery involves showing vulnerability rather than actually demonstrating invulnerability, if I can use that. That's a very interesting perspective, and I can see, Simone, you're obviously nodding in agreement to that. Simone, did you want to come in on that and your perspective on this question?
Yes, I do. I really resonated on that point, because that's some of the things that I've seen, in particular in the Caribbean region, where we tend to be very social, very, very relational. And so one of the areas I find that for leaders is this fear of being vulnerable, because it's associated with weakness. And, it again makes them appear standoffish and not connecting with their teams. But this concept of resilience is so important for today. And so when you observe the decisions that have been made, and this fear of loss of relationship, which I think is tied to that as well. So we do have this innate desire to connect, but it's very lonely, as Silvio said. You have to make some decisions that are unpopular. You have to take huge risks. You have to be vulnerable. And I find in this region, that loss of relationship or being perceived as a good leader or a good person sometimes hinders the leader's ability to really stand in that role effectively. And I go back to the point that I made about the separation of the who and the do, where now a lot of times when you find people who are very technically savvy, they're very knowledgeable in their area, but when they don't have that good sense of who, that good sense of self-awareness and being confident and brave to stand in that, then we now tip over into, so I think that that global leadership concept is a powerful one. And I think it's one that needs to be developed. I see it happening in pockets, I think in professions. I know for the human resources profession, there are actually global certifications that emerged because of multinational companies and having to straddle companies across the world and having to navigate in those environments, having to understand cultures, right? Cultural awareness and being able to connect with people on so many different levels and ways, that I think that concept is one that is worth developing.
Simone, I think I think we would all absolutely subscribe to that. And I've seen myself surveys of global leadership where people ask, globally, what are the characteristics of a leader regardless of circumstance? And it's interesting that listening is one that always comes out close or at the top of characteristics. And then exactly as you said, and I think Abby also alluded to this, that ability really to listen on the part of a leader is such a rare skill or ability, and probably is down to some of those perhaps negative socialization characteristics that we've alluded to in the past, but that clearly the opposite is true also, that it's a sign of that heightened emotional intelligence, isn't it? That ability really to listen and to engage as a result of
listening and also sharing. I find that, again, that's another point that's made, especially when we're talking about mentoring and transitioning and succession planning, that a lot of the emerging leaders are saying senior leaders seem to hoard their expertise, hoard their knowledge. And so we see the institutional knowledge walking out of the door in many cases, and you're starting from scratch because of this. Again, I think it's a fear. It's a fear that, if I share this of myself, if I share this expertise, then I'm diminishing myself in some way.
So there's a direct benefit or penalty to the organization, actually, because of those behaviors as well. That's another really interesting point. Simone, thank you. And Kalyani, I know that you've been thinking about this perspective in the context of our global crisis, haven't you? And I would be particularly interested in your perspective about whether there are some certain traits here that are now in common that are assisting us through this crisis and globally. Kalyani, your perspective on it?
Yeah, while we're talking about the various components of emotional aptitude in leadership, I think one thing to also think about is, or one sort of difference good leaders are able to make is when to tap into the emotions and when not to. When to use emotions as that inner compass, which helps you in your decision making, and when to kind of desist from doing that. And me personally, meditation, yoga and meditation have helped me a lot in this respect. I do think that we also have to create space for people, because a lot of this comes from trial and error. You may not always get this difference right the first time. So we should also create space for leaders to really make the wrong call on this sometimes, like come from a place of anger and make a bad decision, or come from a place of anger and make a good decision, and then really understand for themselves this difference. So I think that's a key kind of skill that we need when we talk about applying the emotional lens to leadership. I will also say that one of the reasons why we've not we are still kind of just beginning to address emotional aspects of leadership is because we've tried for so long to define management as a science. And now we are trying to move away from it and talk about it in more the sense of leadership as an art rather than management as a science. And then on the psychological side of the ledger, what happened for a very long time in psychology was that emotions were thought of as this black box of like all the irrational stuff happening in the mind. And then psychologists kind of decided to unpack that black box and realized that, well, emotional evolution is very much linked to our, evolution as a species. Emotions evolved as defense mechanisms and protective strategies. And they, in fact, follow a lot of kind of patterns, and we can actually identify laws of emotion, as the work of Nico Frida, for example, has done. And so both of these trends are now converging in management and leadership education and in psychology. And if we kind of keep moving in the same direction, we will find that this academic gap that Craig, you talked about in your very initial comments, is going to kind of more and more, I anticipate, be bridged. And now I'll come to your question about this year and some of the lessons that we've learned. I think it's also important to talk about emotions, because the world of work is changing, our relationship to work is changing, and the role that the place that work occupies in our lives is changing, and it has changed for us all, this year. So earlier the concern was how to adapt to career changes throughout your lifetime. Now the concern is how to positively respond to changes in the place that work, our jobs, and our vocation occupy in our lives. And COVID-19 has really kind of laid bare the psycho-emotional complications that arise from a sudden change in the way working life is structured, right? And this is literally like spared nobody. We have all kind of, whether for us academics, of course, we are used to having a 24-hour work cycle. There's no, that's no secret. But for a lot of people for whom going to work every day is an actual thing, or work is a very specific part of their day, I mean, just imagine how much turmoil emotionally this kind of abrupt change has caused. Now, the impact on organizational values, I think, and interpersonal relationships, which this crisis has caused, is something that we are not yet in a position to fully estimate, but we are anecdotally all very well aware of it. And I think this is the new horizon for thinking about how we cultivate emotional strength and resilience in the context of work, and the way it constitutes us as individuals and configures the multiple and cross-cutting social contexts that we inhabit. So I think moving forward, we need to talk about emotions not just as a leadership skill, but as a skill in working life in general, wherever you are in the organizational structure.
Kalyani, thank you so much. That's a fascinating, I think, synopsis, a summary of the relationship between our subject and what we're faced right now. And perhaps I could add one or two of the things that you mentioned that we're seeing in our undergraduates. So the next generation of people coming into the workforce, much more prepared to have these conversations, much more prepared to understand that actually mental well-being, mental resilience, the emotional side is equally as important as all of the external characteristics. I think we've been so traditionally used to measuring the aspects of socializing. I think that's a very positive thing that I'm certainly seeing with my students, many of whom are international. And it sounds to me also, reflecting from your comments, that you're seeing as well. But we are up against time, I'm afraid, colleagues. But I wonder if I might can I just bring you back in very briefly, because just perhaps a minute on developing global citizens, because I know this is such a passion for you as well. Perhaps just a brief word about your perspective on that.
Yes. In fact, what I was mentioning before was on project leadership, with the grassroots level leadership. And post that, global financial crisis happened. And when we took a stock of global financial crisis, people never really paid so much of attention. People with a very high IQ and who are from Ivy Leagues and who are from the best universities and best of the investment bankers and hedge funds, everyone. But they feel that their private actions are private in nature, but the private action does have public consequences. From there, actually, the birth was there for us to think of, do we need to nurture a student, young minds with that kind of sensitivity that business is a subsection or sub-part of the society. Business cannot superimpose the society, but society's goal should be kept in mind. And then we created global citizen leaders who are not meant for corporates alone, but they're meant for they're citizen leaders. And they are not only, I'll say, India-centric, there has to be globe-centric. Now, keeping that in mind, I personally feel that global citizen leader or global leaders concept need to be non-negotiable, and every country must really nurture that. Because whoever today, suppose if Indian guys are heading some of the best of the global companies, if they are not sensitized with respect to the global well-being, not really alone only India well-being, you may be very patriotic about your own country, but let's look at globe as our playing field. From that angle, I think we must really get down to, and design thinking plays extraordinarily powerful role. I didn't touch best on that, but defining the outcome and working that direction in terms of setting the milestones for the young leaders, it is really must. Just very briefly, I'm touching.
Thank you so much, and I'm really pleased we managed to give you time to that. And I think it's a fantastic note for us to finish on. Our colleagues, I'm sure we could continue this discussion for hours, and I know there are perhaps many things that we've touched on that we could explore further, but we are limited by time as always with these. So for me, I think it just remains to thank you all so much for your contribution to what has been, certainly for me, a really interesting discussion, and I'm sure that our listeners have felt the same as well. So it's been an absolute pleasure to run this discussion with you today. So thank you so much on behalf of the University of Lincoln for joining us. Thank you. And I'll now just hand back over to Rishi, who'd like just to conclude and allude to the next in our series. Rishi?
Thank you so much, Craig. And what a fascinating discussion. And why am I not surprised, given the nature of our panelists, it was absolutely amazing. And I really feel that towards the end, we just had to rush it, Craig, but there's so much more that we could have talked about, so many aspects. I'm sure this conversation will go on, and I think this is the starter for many more such interactions at a global level. So thank you so much. We have now touched upon, I'll say, the emotional lens of leadership today. We did the resilient lens of leadership last week. And what a befitting end to say that, if business is a subsection of society, Prof. Adel, like you mentioned, and global leaders and citizen leaders is what we're talking about. The next week's conversation, I think, fits in so beautifully, which is, what does a responsible lens then for that global leader look like? So I think this is actually, rolling over quite logically, to look at, resilient, emotional, and now responsible, which I think is so key, especially in today's world. So thank you so much to our panelists, and that conversation next week. Taz, if you don't mind just pulling up the banner very quickly. Here it is. It's a fantastic panel that we have again from all across the world, and this will be on next week, Wednesday at 10:30 UK time, and hence respectively in your time zones. Taz, thank you. So thanks again for joining us, everyone who's joined us live. We had a huge number of live views here actually today, and I'm sure a lot of people will watch it again subsequently. So really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you, panelists. Really grateful to you and very honored on behalf of the Lincoln International Business School. Thank you again. Thanks so much.